Okay, I got the thumbs up. We can go ahead and start. Again, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kevin Kelly. I'm the CEO for LGS Innovations, the former federal part of Bell Laboratories, now its own independent company, and I have the distinct honor and privilege of being the chairman, along with my vice chair in the back of the room there, Mary Majoros. Hi, Mary. For the INSA's Technology and Innovation Council, a council founded by Bob Farrell maybe 12 years ago, and focusing on connecting the intelligence community with the R&D research and innovation assets of this country as we seek to solve some of the hard problems in the intelligence community. Just a couple of housekeeping notes up front, and then we will turn this over to our esteemed panel. I'd like to thank FCA and INSA for putting on this summit again. I think it's a wonderful opportunity not only for us to get together and discuss some of the important industries, challenges facing the IC and the defense industry as a whole, but also a good chance for us to connect with some of our former colleagues. This is the family business, and I always am impressed to see people that I've known, some of which from my childhood. Just a personal note, I'm a CIA brat, so I was born in Beirut, and then it seemed like everybody chased my mother and father around the world growing up, and I've made a lot of friends along the way, more friends than enemies. Also like to thank Noblest for sponsoring this breakout session. It's very important that we have sponsors that are able to support these efforts. If you have questions for our panel during the session, please jot them down on the note card and pass them towards the aisle. You should have note cards scattered around on every other seat. Pass them towards the aisle. One of our interns, one of our helpers will come by and pick them up. And as long as it's appropriate and it's free of all profanity, I will go ahead and read that question and try to get an answer from the panel. There is a reminder, there may be press or media in the room, just for our panelists to keep that in mind as we make our remarks. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our esteemed panel. Point of note, there were four panelists. Dr. Deb Frincke, who is the head of research for NSA, unfortunately fell ill yesterday. We were hoping for a miraculous recovery this morning, but unfortunately, although she's on the mend, she's not able to attend us today. So we have three esteemed colleagues from the IC here to join us, starting with Dr. Stacey Dixon, who I'm sorry to inform you lost her job as the Deputy Director of IARPA this morning, as DNI Coates has officially promoted, although it was announced about 3 weeks ago, promoted her to the Director of IARPA. So, ma'am, congratulations. Prior to her service with NGA, Dr. Dixon worked on the the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, the HPSC, staff as the program monitor for many national intelligence, science, and technology activities, and then later as its budget director. Prior to supporting the HPSC, she supported both the CIA and the NRO. It's just kind of the family business, isn't it? On advanced technology and R&D programs. Dr. Dixon holds a doctoral and master's degree in mechanical engineering from Georgia Tech and a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from a little school out west called Stanford University. She was also a chemical engineering postdoctorate fellow at the University of Minnesota. Ma'am, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Dr. David Tennenhouse is VMware's Chief Research Officer. He leads the research and innovation activities that are accelerating and extending VMware's technology leadership. These include the formation of a new VMware research group focused on networks and distributed systems, a portfolio of advanced development and incubation activities that are hosted in the product teams, an in-house hackathon experiment prototype program, and various other programs throughout VMware. Prior to joining VMware, David held positions in Microsoft, Intel, and DARPA, where he served as the chief scientist and director of its information technology office. Dr. Tennenhouse holds a BS and an MS in electrical engineering from the University of Toronto and obtained his Ph.D. from the University of Cambridge. Dr. Tennenhouse, thank you for joining us. Gene Stack, Managing Director of Baird Global Technology Services team and co-head of the Baird Government Services Investment Banking Practice, bringing a bit of a different perspective to our panel, showing somebody from industry who's looking at the investment in technology and in companies that bring solutions to the IC and the DoD. She joined Baird this year from Houlihan Lokey, where she was the founding member of the Aerospace, Defense, and Government Services Group, and co-head of the Government Services Practice. With more than 20 years of investment banking experience, Ms. Stack has expertise advising industry-leading companies on mergers and acquisitions, or M&A, more commonly referred to as M&A, capital raising, and other key corporate strategies. She has deep experience in working with companies in a broad range of technology and services sectors, serving clients of founder-owned businesses, private equity-owned firms, and U.S. and international corporate divestitures. Ms. Stack is a board member and executive committee member of the Northern Virginia Technology Council. She graduated cum laude and with a BA degree in economics from Duke University and has studied at the London School of Economics. Ms. Stack, thank you for joining us. I've got a handful of questions here. I'm going to keep an eye on the clock. I want to get to the audience questions, so please don't hold your questions until the end. If something pops in your mind, go ahead and jot it down, and we will consider it in due course. I want to talk about innovation. As I mentioned earlier, one of the goals of INSA, particularly in the Technology and Innovation Council, is to make sure that the IC leadership, the NIST-C, and all the various S&T organizations are aware of innovation that's occurring both in the defense and intelligence industrial base, as well as outside of that in the non-traditional space. So if I could ask, starting with Dr. Dixon, if you wouldn't mind characterizing how well do you feel you and your colleagues in the IC leadership are aware of what's going on in R&D and innovation?
Is this, okay, no light. So I think that depending on the subject matter, depending on the discipline we're talking about, there are better connections with industry, both large, small, with academia, where we can actually know what the innovations are. What we don't have great insight into, frankly, is a lot of the independent research and development that companies are investing in. There are some who have begun to reach out to us and share those things with us, because for us, it's important to know what's already being invested in. We want to invest where others aren't, but knowing that someone is investing in a certain area is helpful for us as we're defining programs. So to some extent, I think we keep up with some of the things that are being done. Probably in every field across the board, we probably don't have great knowledge about the investments that are or the innovations that are happening in industry. Figuring out how to have that better interaction one-on-one. One of the things that IARPA is able to do that I don't know that everyone in the intelligence community is able to or willing to do is literally have those one-on-one conversations with pretty much anyone who reaches out with a good idea. That really helps our program managers know what the state of the art is, but it's not necessarily scalable, and not everyone, because of what they're working on and the protections around it, can actually have those conversations. So figuring out a better way to have those interactions with industry, academia, and the intelligence community would go a long way for those of us who aren't able to have all those conversations ourselves. Good.
So we hear that a lot in industry, and we see a lot of activity, certainly more lately than in prior years, about trying to make those connections. David, from an industry perspective, how would you characterize that perspective? Does the government have the view that they need of what's going on in industry, and particularly as it relates to innovation?
Well, I don't think you ever get enough.
Right.
I mean, when it comes to this business of trying to tap into the knowledge bodies that are out there, and particularly I think it's really important to hybridize knowledge. So that you've got these very committed government program managers, typically very mission committed, and the question is, can you get their knowledge hybridized with the knowledge that's out there externally? And by the way, I have the same problem at VMware. I've got a great set of researchers internally, but realistically, at the end of the day, even if they outperform and we have 10x more ideas per person, it's only going to be a tiny fraction of what's outside. So we focus a lot on making sure that we're well connected with the universities. It's not because the universities have all the good ideas. It's that pretty much anybody with a good idea is going to go talk about it at one of those top tier universities. So if you're making sure your folks are mixing in that pool, it's likely that that's kind of like our radar system. Similarly, we do a lot of outreach to the startup community, even though we're in Silicon Valley. We've always got friends telling us, hey, have you heard about this company, that, et cetera. And more recent development, and when I say recent, it's already sort of 1 to 2 decades, but an important one now is the communities of open source software developers. because they don't necessarily, they sometimes come out of the universities, but they're often, separate from either the startup world or the university world. So to me, it's about hybridizing, and you're probably going to hear that term from me a few times today.
Okay, good. So Gene, a bit of a different perspective from where you sit. And as you look at, in your introduction, we talked about your work with founder-based companies, carve-outs. You talk to a lot of small to medium-sized companies that are, some of whom have based their trade in particular technologies or innovation, and likewise, all the bigs in the industry and what they're looking for. They talk to you about the strategic holes that they're trying to fill. The reason I would imagine the reason they categorize those strategic holes is because of outreach from IARPA and Dr. Dixon's colleagues as they kind of describe what they need to fill in order to meet the mission need. Do you feel that the connection is there? Do you feel that we're doing enough and that the government has the right purview over what's being developed?
Yep. So thank you for that introduction, Kevin, because I'm definitely a student of the industry, although I'm not an operator of the industry. So I view everything from the lens of investment in the industry and how buyers think and how investors think about the market. And I think one of the most important aspects when you think about the technology providers, whether they be commercial technology providers or folks who have the government, technology view, and then the government customers, the most important bridge there is the mission knowledge. And I think, really what, the really connecting the dots comes from those close to the government customer, the trusted advisors to the government customer, or the government itself, who able to articulate, here's what we need from a mission perspective, because when it comes to technology, especially as it relates to the government, what really only matters is how it relates to solving mission challenges.
Right.
And I think that bridge, and you can have the greatest technology in the world, but if it doesn't apply to the problem set at hand in the government, then it doesn't really matter. And I think as we talk about, innovation and government, and one of the great kind of connectors of the dots when you think about the commercial technology landscapes are the resellers and the systems integrators and the technology providers who bundle things together as an overall solution, who have the great vantage point, and Kevin, this is your company, this is what you do, of understanding what the government needs and the variety of different technologies out there when combined with your own can solve the challenging problems.
Yeah, good. So 3 different perspectives, and let me come back to you, Dr. Dixon. I know that IARPA has certain outreach, certainly ODNI, NGA, CIA, others in trying to reach the non-traditionals, whether it's Silicon Valley or other hotspots of technology development. Do you think when they look at the needs of the intelligence community, is that appealing to them? And if you could comment on a couple of different things. The financial aspects, is it appealing to them? Is it what they envisioned when they got together and formed a startup? And then secondly, just the kind of the engagement model. How do they view the acquisition process and life cycle in the government vis-a-vis the commercial industry?
So one of the things that I've been pleased to see in the past couple of years, we always get the question, have you lost interest from academia and businesses because of the leaks and the revelations and sort of the bad press that the intelligence community has had in the past years? Thankfully, no. So people are still finding us. Every time we have a program, I think we increase the number of companies and universities that hear about us and are interested in proposing to the research, because they're really interesting challenges. And as long as we keep the challenges really interesting, I think we will continue to have interest in places that don't typically work with the intelligence community, or even more broadly, don't typically work with government. Having said that, I've also heard that people are very wary of if they'll lose their intellectual property, and that keeps some people from proposing. I would argue that what we expect out of IP based on what we fund is very reasonable. There's always a negotiation, and so we're able to get most of the people through that process so that there isn't that concern, but that is one that's kind of high up there. One of the other ones that I find interesting, and I'm glad Jean's on the panel, is the difference between something that will be commercially marketable and something that the intelligence community needs. There may be a very big difference there. And the guidance that they're getting from venture capitalists versus their expectations from us, we're generally not going to be able to compete with some of those larger influxes of funds. So we ought to sort of rely on, their interest in the problem, their interest in serving the country and helping national security, because we're not going to compete with that. How do they balance being able to have a commercially viable product with something that also can be tailored to actually help out inside the community? Is sort of a fine balance.
Does it work?
It does.
The plea to patriotism, does it work?
It does in many ways.
Good.
I think in other ways, we've lost companies that are lost universities who have become startups as a result of the research and then gotten bought off by someone else. So there are times when we are on the losing side of that, not because we haven't tried to work it out, but for the most part, I think that we do get a number of people that continue to apply for us, but I wonder whether, as increasingly amounts of venture funds are overlapping where the intelligence community is interested, if we're going to be on the losing end of that.
So that's something we collectively can help with. One of the things I like to say, and we meet with developers in Silicon Valley and other places, is we all have different goals and different aspirations and different motivations, but I sleep under one flag, and so do they, and it's really important. You don't have to subscribe to everything that you hear in the news, but there are some really important missions, very, very important missions, and it behooves us all to make sure that we avail ourselves of all the necessary tools to solve our problems. David, how about from your perspective? You have commercial and government. You have assuredly you've got some interaction with the ventures, the two guys in the garage. What do you think?
Well, I spent a number of years as a VC. So from a VC point of view, as a financial question, it doesn't really work for most startups. Now you sort of have to think about it, and I think you covered this a bit, which is you have certain cases where the technology just happens to be one where the government's going to be the main buyer. It's a new type of jet engine for, super performance aircraft. Well, I guess you're probably talking to the government. No problem. We understand that. There are other cases where the government can be a straight off-the-shelf COTS consumer. It's just going on the GSA list. Right? People will acquire it. No problem. When it gets into what I think of as COTS plus, and it needs to be wrapped, what you really need to do, and I think you indicated this, you've got to work with that defense industrial base. Because essentially it's got to be a sell-through. The moment a startup starts tying itself up, trying to sort of cater to the specific requirements, it's just going to lose velocity.
Yep.
And then it's not actually going to achieve what the government wants either, because it'll fall behind. So it's, I think, a question, I said you're going to hear this hybridizing word.
Yep.
There it's about how do you also hybridize these startups with your industrial base, with the folks that can actually bring this forward, ruggedize it if it needs to be ruggedized, may operate it for you, increasingly in a services-based world, and do all the things that need to be done. I do think that there's an aspect here that has to do with also, because I think you indicated this about making it challenging and interesting, where the government can play a role and then hope to kind of capture things on the back side of it, is whether it's a startup or a large company, what I'm always challenging people to do is build a prototype as quickly as possible.
Yep.
Okay, you got the prototype. Now, get it in the hands of someone
Right.
who's a really aggressive user as quickly as possible. Government customers, and you mentioned this, these mission-oriented folks who've got a huge passion, they've got a mission, they've got a problem, they just want it solved, those are perfect POC candidates.
Right.
So I think there's a real role you can play there. And then, again, later you have to kind of hybridize them with somebody who's going to be the path towards acquisition.
Right. Yeah, it's good advice. Get it built, get it off slides, get it in someone's hand, and you'll learn a lot, certainly from the mission operators. They'll give you feedback right away. Hey, I wish it did this, and how come it does that, and I like this, I don't like that.
Yeah, and if it, and often you as an innovator have this whole roadmap. You've got the things you do for what we call the minimum viable product.
Right.
And you in your mind have all these are the next important things. A real mission operator will come in and tell you, actually, those don't matter, but if you don't give me this one little feature here, which is probably pretty easy to put in now, it's not going to be useful.
Right, right. Good advice. So, Gene, you have to wear many hats. One of them is matchmaker. I mentioned earlier you having to understand the needs of the systems integrators and kind of the wants and desires and the capabilities of some of the companies and the assets that they're trying to make a match. They're trying to sell the company, they're trying to seek investment. In your conversations with them, have you ever come across one that says, oh, I'm not interested in government funding, or I don't want to get pulled into the government business, or I'd go there if they did things differently? Is there any inhibitors? Is there any apprehension, or do you find it to be a pretty easy sled?
Now, when it comes from the vantage point of the commercial guys, the two guys in a garage, if you will, the government market is just not appealing just by the pure nature of the market. Just, if you think about it, these are guys who are mortgaging their houses and they're, bootstrapping their companies. What's important to them? Speed to market, right? Scalable solutions, right? Things that don't require customization, things that you can sell off the shelf. That's what they're looking for. So what's important? Growth, profit, visibility in the business. And that, it's not that it's, completely different. It's the opposite. It's just a different kind of philosophy or a different way to get to the end state. The government contracting process is burdensome. There's a lot of rules. You've got the FAR. If you're starting up a company and you've got a quick sale, into a commercial market where the speed is days and not years, that's a much more attractive business model. And maybe just to further the point, when you think about the investors in venture capital type companies and what metrics they're looking to achieve, the metrics look very different from investors in the government space. So what do they look for? They look for growth north of 25% compounded annually. They look for operating profit margins of 20%, 30%, 40%, and gross margins kind of well north of 60% type gross margins. They're looking for returns on their investments, IRRs, if you will, of 35% or more. They've got 10 investments in their portfolio. 1 in 10 will be successful. The other 9 will either be marginal or fail. So again, it's just a different driving factor. And again, the government mission requires some degree of customization. The problem sets are fundamentally different. I mean, there's some commonality in terms, in some cases, size of data sets required, but they're even within the government, the problem sets are different and requires customization. So, when I think about technology as a commercial technology and coming into the government market, I think about it a little bit as a government pull rather than a technology push, right? A commercial technology push into government. And you get there through the mission, I think, through understanding the mission needs, through the industrial base.
So we've talked a little bit about...
Can I just, I'm sorry to say,
yeah,
I just
absolutely.
want to jump in there and say something important there is, and it's not all bad. So when those startups go and they move really fast and they grow and you end up with a VMware and a Google and a Microsoft and an Intel and a Cisco, and they're all American companies, and our government later buys from them, so maybe it buys from them 4 or 5 years later, not right away. Right. But it means that we have an industrial base fed by technologies that have been developed, designed here in the U.S., and that's a huge advantage.
So David, sticking with you, how does a company either in the VC world, as they're considering what marketplace to enter, or in an established company where they may have government and commercial offers, how do they view the federal government marketplace writ large, and maybe more specifically Intel and DoD? How do they view them as a funding source? Is that when you start looking at cost recovery and IRAD and the issues with entangling your intellectual property, from an industry perspective, how do we look at them as a source of funding versus a traditional banker or an investor?
Yeah, first off, let me take the IP thing off the table and say this seems to be some fable in the VC community that it's an issue.
Agree 100%.
Now that's because I started on the DARPA side before I went to the VC side, so I was kind of in your role. But the marching right issue, I've never actually found a lawyer that has a problem with it.
It's easy enough to navigate.
It's a perceived issue. Yeah. So I do want to take that off the table. What I'd say, though, is realistically, and this goes to the the comment about business model is just really different. We're not looking for government to fund the development.
Right.
So, right now in the past, we have not been actually taking government funding in any of those paths. I could imagine us, applying for and taking government funding, but the only reason for doing it would be because we wanted to be part of a program and be part of a community that was working on something that we thought was going to be really interesting and exciting, and our people wanted to be involved with it, and it turned out that the only way to really do that was to actually, have a grant or a contract or something. So it's really just a difference in business model, because you said you're going for higher return. Now, that's not being critical. Again, the business model of the sort of contractor industrial base is to be funded all the way along, because,
Right.
and that makes sense, because these things take longer than the patience that companies in the commercial world have. So if you're going to work on sort of a fighter aircraft, you better get paid as you go, because otherwise, you're just never going to make that kind of investment till the thing goes into, initial operating production capability.
So turning to Dr. Dixon, I want to get your perspective, and Gene and David, I want to come back to you on the same question. What's the downside? What's the downside to to accepting the government as an investor in technology? And there's I want you to separate the In-Q-Tel model, which is an investment model, from the IARPA model, which is bring me your ideas and I will fund either alongside you or entirely the development of that, because it's really important to me. What do you think the innovator's downside is to doing that?
It's just a longer process right now,
Why?
even for research and development. Although we have some authorities that we can use that on the operations and maintenance side don't exist, it's still a long process. And our requirements the reporting requirements, the invoicing requirements can be cumbersome, especially for those that are smaller companies.
Right.
So for us, we need to figure out how to make it easier for
Right.
people to work with us.
Right.
That really is the main downside that I've seen. I think in many other ways, there's a lot of upside. There's a lot of exposure opportunities once you're known as an innovative company to doing more business within government.
Absolutely.
There's sort of the intangible of really pushing the science, pushing the engineering in a field and doing something truly remarkable that's going to have a great impact on the intelligence community and national security.
Right.
So as far as I'm concerned, there aren't many downsides minus the time that it takes.
So it's not that I'm a panelist, but I'll take some executive privilege here. I agree that the IP issue is a bit of a fable and a head scratcher from my perspective as to why that is a primary concern. It doesn't seem to impede us in any way, but it does come up. I'm not sure why. So I'm glad you didn't mention that as being an impediment. But likewise, I'll say this about the development timeline. Sometimes it's advantageous from an industry perspective because you lack the confidence that you can move as fast as a commercial entity might need you to move, or an investor when they want to see an ROI in 12 to 18 months, and you're thinking, there's some physics here that we've got to get through, and this may take me 24 months to get there. And DARPA and IARPA are wonderful places to go for that because they have the patience and the knowledge to see you through. So let me turn to the industry side, Gene. As you're talking with companies that have technology and innovation assets, both commercial and government, do you see any concern that they have, or would you express any concern with them exposing their commercial assets or their commercial investments to the government, or likewise seeking the government to provide investment versus turning to the banks or to the venture capitalists?
Yeah, so maybe to answer that question directly, and I'm going to go back to the IP side of it too, but I think the biggest challenge with the government as an investor, I think part of it is the perception, that they may have, the perception, certainly we talked about the timeline and some of the cumbersome rules associated with it, but again, 2 years, 24 months is an eternity for the tech community. While it's great that because the physics takes that long, the patience of investors aren't that long. They're in and out of an investment in 3 years or maybe 4 years. So to see something through and you don't know if there's a success or a failure, until 24 months, I think is a little bit problematic. I do think the more examples there are of funding that has gone that distance and has resulted in a major sizable financial success. Now, again, there's a difference, maybe difference between mission success and a financial success, but the lens from the investment community, it's about the financial success of the investment, which I'm not going to opine is right or wrong, but that's the lens they view the success with, of an investment. So I said that's probably the downside: the time, the rules, and then sometimes it's the the association. I mean, I think probably the biggest one that we hear now is Google, right? Associated with the Maven program and artificial intelligence, and that's a shame, right? That we have that kind of impact. But going back to your commentary also on intellectual property, it's funny. It's always an issue in the mergers and acquisitions that we do, the ownership of the intellectual property, and being able to ascribe that in divestitures. Who owns it, the parent or the subsidiary? I'm sure you dealt with this in your buyout, right? And the same thing with the government. And maybe it's more of a myth than a reality. Maybe the government doesn't go, maybe government don't go out and seek it, but it's certainly an area, a core area of diligence. There's really only, a couple of key areas of diligence, and I think IP, ownership of the intellectual property, is one of the core areas, and clarity around that ownership of IP.
So going back to what David said, it is very navigable. A good attorney and some discipline and process can go an awful long way in my perspective from an IP standpoint.
And maybe if I can just continue kind of with the thought about the investment community and how they view success and successes. If you think about some of the big successes in the investment community who started in government, the ones that come to mind, clearly FireEye, right, is a key, or Palantir, started as government-funded companies and pivoted to commercial. They never lost their government roots, but the big scalability in their solutions, where they didn't need to customize so much, and they, you see that, it's those kinds of examples I think are very helpful, to investing in the government-started technologies. But if you think about one characteristic those companies had in common, is they were both working on problem sets where the government was funding with enormous dollars, towards data analytics, the data analytics problem, right? And on the mission, on the field, and then towards the cybersecurity problem. So if you think about, areas where you see that bridge and that success on both sides, it's where the government is throwing money for good reason, right? For a big problem.
Right. So David, let me shift gears with you a little bit. Talking about government as a funder. If we are not successful in making the connection between the innovator and the mission, or there's a perception out there that a founder, an innovator, an entrepreneur is going to entangle in some way their IP, and therefore they don't even want to have the discussion, or, in the case of what Jean described, the return on investment timeline is too short, and they're looking for a much faster adoption and development model. In other words, if the innovator is not availing themselves of the government as a funder, might our adversaries be a threat here? We've heard a lot about Chinese investment in technology, acquiring companies, funding startups, and things of that nature. Is that just ordinary global business, or do we think that's, both from an industry perspective and from a government perspective, is that a real threat?
I think we need to sort of distinguish. You got to unpack that one quite a bit. For one thing, I'll try and take the foreign government question first and say the thing that I'm be more concerned about from the point of view of foreign governments is that we have benefited immensely from a very long-term, sustained flow of brain power into this country.
Right.
I'm an immigrant. I have a Canadian accent. I can say A. I'm proud to be, a U.S. citizen, and but I am an immigrant. And if you look around the National Academy of Engineering, you'd find it's full of immigrants. If you look at the founders of all these, startups, you'd find a very large fraction of them are immigrants, and we've had that sustained flow. So if we're talking about the risk here, the risk is that all those folks are now going to go start companies in those other countries, feeding their economies, and economic security is core to our national security. And, you know, what if we were buying, you know, all chips that instead of being designed by Intel have been designed somewhere else? What if we were, you know, dependent on operating systems that had come from somewhere else? Let's just think about, you know, all the benefits that we've had. So that would be my concern about those foreign governments. In terms of investment in startups, to be really honest, look, if the entrepreneur's working on this 2-year thing,
Right.
don't worry about it. You know, in some sense, so it'll go out to industry. From a government timeline, we need, you know, the big advantage you have in governments and in universities is you can think in long timelines. In large companies, an advantage we have is we can actually think in longer timelines than the startups.
Yeah.
Because they need to sort of hit these milestones pretty quickly. They've got to start getting traction, and then they have to scale. So for example, when I look at within VMware, my blockchain investments and things like that are because, to be quite honest, I'm expecting there to be a downturn in interest in blockchain. All those startups will get washed out, and we can sustain through that. Okay, that's a good investment space for me. So if I go back to government, the thing that worries me the most isn't those other countries in terms of them funding the 2-year startup people. It's we seem to have lost the will to provide the leadership in inspiring people and in setting the agendas. So we're still, you know, you mentioned 2 areas where the government actually set agendas, successful startups that had a government focus, and then went out and became large industrial. I think that particularly in my area, information technology, and I'd also say to some degree in the defensive side of cybersecurity, we are not setting the agenda from the government and inspiring people. It's not necessarily even about the money. It's about reaching people earlier in their career and getting them connected to those government mission folks so that when they go ahead and invent things, they just solve the problem as a side effect, even if it ends up getting sold into the commercial sector. And so that's the thing that worries me the most is our will to be the agenda setter for science and technology across the board.
So we do talk a lot about that in various forums in INSA and FCA. Dr. Dixon, how do we, you know, there was a time when if you were in a STEM-related field, your whole mission in life was to work for NASA. And then it may have been for some of the, you know, some large enterprise with IBM or General Electric or, you know, some company that's really producing innovative solutions out there. And now there's a wide range of companies. It's become very frothy and in a very rich environment. How do we inspire that next generation, both for government service as well as being part of the defense industrial base?
Good question. I think there's sort of a general understanding that the number of STEM professionals graduating from universities is not what it needs to be able to sustain either industry or government. So there is something that the government can do to inspire that. There's just a different conversation that's needed, I think, with the young people about STEM and the importance of it in the country. If you really learn what it is, I think it can't help but be inspiring.
Right.
So it's, you know, it's not entertainment, it's not sports, but in terms of professions, it's one that really should hold its own, and for whatever reason, we're not having the right conversation to get kids motivated. There are definitely things that the government used to do with respect to having a lot of money in scholarships and grants and being able to really move the ball with having more graduates come out of schools. The government could do more of that now, and I think there are conversations that are beginning to happen, especially as the need for more people in data science and cybersecurity and artificial intelligence, as those increase, we could play a role in kind of moving people forward. With respect to sort of inspiring innovation, one of the reasons the government used to be able to do that more so than anyone else is the things that we were inspiring were so expensive that maybe
Right.
only the government could afford it. And
Right.
now things aren't, I mean, there's still things that are a lot very expensive, but now the number of things that we need, the innovations, don't cost as much money in many situations. So there are a lot of other people who can help fund those, and it's not the sole responsibility of the government anymore because they're not things that only the government can fund. So we have to figure out how to play in that space. a little bit better than we have, I think. I don't think we're ever going to get back to the place where we're truly inspiring everything, because there's just so many interesting things that are able to be done at a much lower level. The sort of democratization of innovation has happened. So we need to figure out how
Let's
to...
do some.
Oh, agreed. And I think there are pockets of us that definitely are. I mean, there's certainly things that are needed now, and others who are taking that longer-term look at what needs to be invested in, what kind of innovations we're looking for. But it's harder for the operational missions to have those longer-term looks because they've got the near-term needs.
But back to David's point, whether it's inspiring them to apply it directly to a government mission space or in the commercial world, let it happen. Let the innovation occur. And we will in this community find a way to get it applied to the mission space.
And maybe just to add to that point, since we're talking about workforce as it applies to innovation, and I have the benefit of actually seeing a lot of younger companies kind of growing up with this young techie workforce. And just as an observation, it seems what that tech workforce is really looking for is pretty simple. It's like it's working with the latest and greatest technologies and tools and really being on the cutting edge of solving problems and working and surrounding themselves with people who are helping them kind of learn and put it all together. And of course the mission is really important. So as we see the agility and how the innovation, the innovative government industrial base can be competitive with somebody with the likes of Google and those others. It's nice because you can combine, if you can capture, that latest and greatest technology toolkit and combine it with the mission set, right, and working on the toughest challenges, I think you can see, and competitive pay.
Right.
But honestly, I think that tends to be less important than working on the latest and greatest cutting edge problems.
So I think you're hitting on one of the key challenges of the IC, and that is, if they only knew how cool this was, and there's a lot that you can't say, right? Technology in and of itself is rarely classified. How you're using it, kind of that exciting Hollywood, version is oftentimes,
And to that point,
behind closed doors.
we work with companies who a lot of the youngsters, they don't want to get their clearances.
Right.
Which I find fascinating, right? So,
Right.
because then they'd have access to seeing the problems and the
Right.
missions they're solving.
So that's a huge opening for, I think, a lot of us to figure out how do we I won't say take advantage, how do we leverage the talent that's out there without having to have people have clearances? And we're definitely we're continuing to have that conversation within the intelligence community and perhaps even getting some traction soon.
And I feel like, coming up with proxy problems
Right.
is something we used to be really good at.
Yep.
I'm not in the loop enough to know how good we are now, but that's really pretty critical.
That's a good
right?
point.
So we can't depend on, everybody being cleared, and to be honest, if it's the two propeller head researcher, they may not be the one that you even want cleared.
Right.
It's fine. We need to give them the proxy problem that's still an exciting problem that has lots of interesting applications, and where this community would know how to take advantage of the results.
Stacey, I want to revisit something you mentioned earlier about changing the model, you talked about hastening the development life cycle or the acquisition process so that it becomes more attractive to a larger number of innovative people and companies out there. You cannot go to a government conference without hearing acquisition reform. In your mind, what can we do? I think one of the things we mentioned was making sure that we're taking advantage of finding those technology solutions and applying them either through a proxy or in an arm's length transaction. What can we do in industry or on the government side about the model? And then as a follow-up on that, what are your views on OTAs? It's kind of been a go-to model recently, more recently than before, but if you could answer those two.
So some of it is making sure that we're not making things harder than they have to be.
Yeah.
I think there's a comfort level in following, and I'm not going to say following the rules, it's more than that. It's following the rules and making sure that there's absolutely no gray area. We're so far away from that particular line, but we've made it more burdensome for ourselves and anyone that we're partnering with. So part of it is just how we look at the laws that are out there, because there are some organizations that have figured out how to get things done within the law, and more of us need to do things like that.
Yep.
With respect to research, I feel like the rules do need to change. With respect to the things that we're buying now that have much shorter cycles than, say, buying an aircraft carrier, which definitely takes a longer period of time, those should be different kinds of acquisitions.
Right.
We should be able to, for something that's going to need multiple spins and where you're going to deliver things incrementally, we should be able to do that a lot more easily within whatever the regulations are.
Yep. Along those lines, I give DARPA and IARPA a lot of credit for doing a few things. One is making multiple awards for the same problem set, because you expect failure. Failure has to be part of the process. And I might fund 5 and have 5 successes. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Well, going back to Gene's example, it's more realistic to say 1 out of 10. And so that's one thing I give you a lot of credit for. Looking at the failure and the tolerance for failure and risk in the R&D community, and particularly as it applies to the IC. Do you think we have the right balance? Do you think we can accept failure in the right level?
I think we do have to have a different conversation about failure and risk. The challenge is for someone like IARPA that has a much longer time horizon, we can accept failure along the way because there's no one out in the field right now that is dependent on what we're going to deliver in the next 6 weeks. For an organization that has a much shorter time horizon, that's a different type of risk tolerance, and I understand why they can't. I don't know that we're having the best conversation about the sort of the space in between and how we can accept more risk, the longer, especially for those longer time horizon things. So I think there's a conversation that can happen and that we can get better at accepting it. The interesting thing for us is, even though the failure for us happens in a couple of ways. You know, there's one where the technology just isn't ready yet, and that's a good thing to know. And that's actually a lesson that you want to learn. There's the programmatic failure, which is just poorly run. We'd never want to have that one. And then there's it couldn't achieve the milestones, but it pushed it farther than what the current state of the art is. That is a wonderful kind of failure because someone can learn from that and can actually improve the current capabilities while we work towards what's coming. So changing the conversation about failure and seeing what we can learn from even things that don't achieve whatever it is the milestone we're trying to achieve.
Yep.
You asked about OTAs.
Yes.
It's definitely a tool in the toolkit that we and IARPA need to use more of, but that I think others in both DoD and in the IC have figured out how to make work. I anticipate that we'll see more of it. We definitely have to use it on the right things so that we don't have the negative reports coming down on how it's been used incorrectly in some cases.
Right.
So if we're using it the right way, I think it's a great thing and something I think we'll see more of.
Okay. All right. From an industry's perspective, David, how do you think we should change the model? Would you say anything different? And then likewise, do you have a view on the use of OTAs?
Well, I guess on the use of OTAs, I thought I was going to be counter, but I think you're saying what I would have said, which is, and I'd even extend it and say, let's say everybody really used OTAs for lots and lots of things. You'd end up with one mechanism. Eventually something would go wrong. Somebody would do something wrong. It's actually much better to have a range of tools in the toolbox. Right. You were talking about risk management. That's a type of risk management. So my view actually is there are a variety of tools. I had never, until I went into government, heard the term overcompliance, and you mentioned it. So I think you hit that, which is, the catch is some of the other tools are actually perfectly valid for many purposes, and if people are over-complying and reading the rules far too narrowly than intended, then you're going to have a problem. So you need that help getting your job done.
Right.
By the way, we have similar things in large companies are not as different from government as they would like to think. That was one of my big learnings in going from government to industry. The key phrase I learned is when speaking to our lawyer is my business need is, and then X, because otherwise they're just going to go into risk avoidance mode. And instead I have to get them here's what I need to do. You help figure out how I'm going to do it safely. So don't overuse OTAs.
That's right.
In terms of the broader issue, I think, you sort of hit it here. Different types of projects need to be risk managed in different ways. And even if it is actually a longer-term project, or a larger project that is a big bet. So even for longer term projects, you have you're doing an aircraft carrier. So we're only going to build a few of them. It better work. by the way, at Intel, we had the same thing. We're building a semiconductor fab. Each generation of those is a bet the company thing.
Yeah.
However, if you crack that open, it can be managed as a portfolio and say, okay, but what's the menu for the equipment going into that fab? And I'll have multiple suppliers competing it out, et cetera. And I'll do that risk management while still making sure I'm getting a lot of innovation along the way in that menu. Towards the end game, I'm going to have to make certain decisions about which items off that menu get incorporated into the final thing. So I think this is doable. What's not doable is if you try to take all the risk out up front. Now, what I will say is, if you're at IARPA, you should operate that way. If you're the contractor, IARPA or whoever should not allow you to hedge. So in other words, it's not good if everybody's hedging at every level. That's how we end up taking all the risk out of the system and all the innovation with it. If you have, I think, really good government program managers who are running a portfolio and they're hedging, but they make sure that their contractors are, really going for it and purely going for it, then you get a system that gets you the best of both worlds.
Yeah. So Gene, hearing a lot about the model and changing the model, would you say anything in support of or in contrary to your colleagues on the panel, and particularly as it relates to OTAs?
I would say it's so nice the direction the industry is headed today versus where we were 5 years ago with all the focus on low cost.
Yes.
And where we are today. I think it's just, people are investing in technology and investing their own resources in technology. And I like the view about the different business models. And it's not just OTAs,
Right.
and there's resurgence of sole source, there's use of as a service business model and fixed price delivery. And I think all of those concepts really spark innovation because you're able to get that risk return trade-off, right? Invest, find a better, cheaper, faster solution, get the financial rewards and benefits. So, in general, I'm a big fan of where we're headed, and completely agree as you look at having the different, to your point, tools in the toolkit, different
Right.
ways to procure different solutions, whether they be as a service or sole source or OTAs, and allowing that creativity and innovation it's an exciting place to be today.
Good.
Versus where we were.
I'm
Yeah,
sorry,
go
I
ahead.
realized I wanted to pose one challenge, and I think you hinted at it, which is on the contractual thing, as more and more things are sold as a service, like sort of in the commercial world, to put this in place, aircraft engines are sold by the hour on the wing as a service, right? So as more and more, now imagine everything else. I don't think we have the vehicles in place and the mechanisms in place for government agencies and particularly defense and intel community to be able to procure those services, those things that are coming monthly. And it's both contractual vehicles and it's also budgeting because now it's a different kind of expense. So
There's a
say
security.
that is a concern.
I'll add another layer. There's a security aspect in there too. As you get into the business of the intelligence community, there's only so much in terms of authorities and international law that a provider can provide as a service. They have the technical capability but lack the legal
Right.
authority to do it.
So there's a gulf developing
Yep.
there
Yep.
that is
Yeah.
worrisome.
I see it, and maybe it depends on where you sit in the what kinds of problems that you're solving for. Where I've seen the as a service delivery model become more a viable solution in government is the kind of infrastructure as a service business model, right? Kind of allowing the contractor community to build the network, right? And the government just pay for its use of the network. Some as a service around, you definitely see agile as a service, right? Buying kind of agile teams, right? Scrum teams.
Right.
We see more of that. And then lately, I've heard more about security, like cyber as a service, cybersecurity, more on the defensive side, right? Cyber defense as a service. And then obviously cloud, right? So that's where we see it in some of the more the IT side
Right.
of the problem sets and the as a service. But I think in addition to the vehicle access and the vehicle opportunities, I think the other innovation I think the government officials have brought in is the way they're evaluating the community, right? So having tech challenges, right? And I mean, orals is part of it, but doing coding challenges and tech challenges and moving away from some of the bigger kind of volumes of procurement is also very innovative, right? And it's interesting as well.
Right. No, it's a very good point. And the one bit of advice I would give to the government, and the S&T community is less guilty of this certainly than some of the larger programs, is when you have a competition, make an award. Make an award. Don't let your RFP have a birthday. You know, that is one of the most discouraging things to industry, because they spend a lot of money on developing the technology and the teams and the proposals and getting everything pulled together, and then it just kind of sits. Let me shift gears. We've got about 15 minutes left, and we've got some good questions from the audience. A rather technical one, so I'm looking straight at you. What do you think about synthetic biological threat, weaponized infectious diseases? We've heard a little bit about that, more than I thought I was going to hear at this conference, but any thoughts?
Yes. We, within the past couple of years, have increased our investments in that area, particularly in trying to understand when someone is engineering biology, specifically for purposes of threatening the country or threatening some aspect of, whether it's agriculture or water supply or whatever the case may be. That's definitely something that we are investing in because we see a need. Also trying to understand if the tools that exist right now in terms of sequencing and understanding how you can essentially decide that you need a compound made and send it to a lab and they'll make it for you. And there are some checks in that process, but not nearly enough as things get more complicated and people decide to sort of split up their order and send it to different sequencing organizations. So there's a need to kind of look at things that way and look and see if there's a better way to analyze the threat of a compound as opposed to the way that we've done it in the past. So we will continue, I think, to see investments in that area. Interestingly enough, there are a lot of investments in the venture side in that space as well. So we're sort of competing with that, but I think it's all to the common good, because if the tools get better, it will benefit everyone. Our specific needs may be somewhat specific, but we'll benefit from all that other investment as well. Right. So it's something that we think about a lot. It's probably my biggest worry, because I don't hear it talked about nearly enough in terms of what the threat could be. I think we all know nuclear, we know cyber in terms of how bad the situation can be if there's an attack in those cases. Illnesses, the way that influenza that spreads in communities, the productivity level that's lost, let alone the mortality issues that would come about if a virus of unknown origin, of high virality, got into a population and then started spreading just because of the global nature of how we interact with people. I don't think we have truly come to grips with what that could mean and how quickly that could be much worse than anything else we've imagined. Not to be the doomsday person or anything.
No, well, I appreciate that you described to us what concerns you, because I was many years ago on a panel where the then director of S&T for OD&I asked me what keeps me up at night, and I said, well, what's going to keep me up at night now is the fact that you just asked me that question. You're supposed to know. If you don't know, that concerns me. For anybody on the panel, we didn't talk much about this, but David, you hit on a little bit when you talked about open source. How would you manage the supply chain risk, particularly as it's related to the intelligence community solutions, including digital supply chain? So not just the componentry, but the digital supply chain. How should we think about that?
This has been a long-standing problem. I was actually on a Defense Science Board study many years ago related particularly to the microchips.
Right.
And so and the ways in which those could be in some sense tampered with. I think it's it's basically a layered defense, right? Clearly, it has to do with in banking, there's know your customer. In this supply chain, I think it's know your supplier, and I think making sure that they have best practices in place. I don't have a magic bullet on that one. And I think the one thing we should definitely be very cognizant of is it's not just, say, an IC or a DoD problem, because it extends into the base. And then from the supplier base, you get into all the other critical infrastructures. And pretty much you get into sort of, you know, people's confidence in the economy writ large.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think it enters into our broader question about cyber defense. I feel that, again, that's a place where we sort of stopped having a kind of coherent government leadership on the defense side. And when I go to the academic conferences in the security space, what I find there is actually quite disappointing. There are some brilliant people working on cryptography, and they're doing great work, but the truth is that's actually not the problem, right? The problem's all in the engineering.
Right.
It's rarely, you know, crypto. Then there are people working on exploits. If you go try to find the leading academics in the country, or industry researchers or whatever, working on systematic ways to improve defense, cyber defense, and I'd include you know, that this goes to the, you know, the software supply chain effectively, you're going to come up pretty empty. And that's a real failing. There's one of the biggest problems we're facing. It's both a commercial and defense problem. It's crying out for leadership.
Interesting. I'm going to take this next audience question, and Gene, I'm going to direct this at you. You work a lot with small business, certainly not exclusively. Are there measures or resources in place to help small businesses streamline government funding, responses to invoices, things like that? You know, one of the difficulties and perhaps one of the inhibitors to the government availing themselves of some of the technologies in the small businesses, they have bills to pay on a shorter period than that are due on a shorter period than they can sustain. Is that something that you hear about and from small business, and do you think that there's some middle ground that can be reached there, or is that kind of unique to specific
I
companies?
actually do think there's some resources in place to help small businesses who face that challenge. You know, there are firms who do sort of all of the outsourced accounting and HR who specialize in this industry, so it takes something from an investment to make it more of an operating expense, sort of a pay-as-you-go. I certainly think when it comes to accounts receivable, whether, you know, you have a prime contractor or you're working directly with the government, you know, there are absolutely mechanisms in place to make sure that you're paid in a timely fashion, and there's also financial institutions that will, you know, buy the receivables, buy government receivables from you as well. So you're definitely not alone there in terms of having the resources to help with those, you know, to help with those burdens. And then obviously from an innovation standpoint, I think, you know, the contracting mechanisms we talked about, the resurgence of, or the advancement of OTAs, I think that will help a lot from a funding perspective. Move to a government adoption, even if it is a prototype or a, you know, an initial prototype, and then moving into manufacturing without the fear of a long-term protest, right? I think those will help as well. So there's a number of companies out. I'll just mention Neosystems because somebody was talking about them earlier today as one resource there, but there are many others.
Yeah, it's important that they provide that service. One of the fear points in my dealing with small business is just that. I don't want to have to build the infrastructure. I can't afford to build the infrastructure. I can't change the compliance regime of my entire book set to match what DCAA or DCMA is looking for. One last question, time for one last question for anybody on the panel, and I will make the point that we have gone 65 minutes and not mentioned AI until right now. So somebody asked an AI question. It's not that we're opposed to AI, certainly, but it's one of the fears I have is if everything is AI, then nothing is AI. So we got to get real specific about what artificial intelligence is, and not put too many challenges in the AI bucket. And I think David and you and I were talking before this, and sometimes when things are poorly defined, you kind of shove it into the amorphous bucket, and at the moment, that's artificial intelligence. But it's a real thing. It's important. There's investment in that space. So for anybody on the panel, in the next year, in the next 2 years, what do we think is going to come out? What important innovation do we hope to see come out of the artificial intelligence world? Anybody?
if we can better understand what it's doing,
Yep.
what our machine learning algorithms are doing, what those classifiers that come out, how they were formulated, that to me would be a huge step. So there's a lot of great things that we're able to do with machine learning, but not understanding why it pointed to a certain thing as being, this should be the target. Well, how did you get to that answer? Understanding the AI
Yep.
would be a huge step for me to see.
That's a good first step. Anybody else?
Well, actually, I keep thinking that, and I know I'm sitting near an intelligence person, so you must be looking at my notes. I'd say...
The pages are blank, aren't they, Stacey? They're blank. There's nothing.
She bugged the pen. I've been really careful not to pick up any devices at this meeting. The first thing I picked up. Going back to what AI is and isn't, and this goes, I've had the same line since I was at DARPA, so it's been good for 20 years, is AI's all the stuff we don't know how to do yet. As soon as we know how to do it, we give it another name. We call it, factory automation. We call it machine learning. Today, I actually think the public has, instead of getting a science answer for AI, the public has actually segregated this. Machine learning has to do with correlation, patterns, outlier detection. AI seems to have to do with when the machines are interacting with humans. So things like the chatbots they think of as AI. And to some degree, autonomous vehicles, even though the purpose is to not interact with because humans are using it directly and experiencing it. I do think it, but just as, it was the same thing when you said, instead of saying what should we expect to see, but what do we hope to see in the next couple of years, explainability.
Yeah.
I worry a great deal that the machine learning community has gotten, and in fact it's leaked into pretty much every other field, is doing networking with a little machine learning, information assurance with some machine learning. So it's in all these spaces, people have gotten totally enamored with deep neural networks or variants thereof, where we don't really have a good understanding of how they work. And that's not the way we do science, and it's certainly not the way we do engineering, right? And by the way, also even in the intelligence community where things may not be totally visible to the public, in fact, the goal is often to make it invisible. In all these cases, here's my analogy. People get in a car, or they get on a jet plane, they get on an aircraft. They don't really understand how the jet engines work. However, they do believe that there are engineers that fully understand how those engines work. So when the public finds out that we're doing a whole bunch of things with machine learning and we don't understand how it works, that is not going to go down well. It's not going to go down well whether it's the Intel community, whether it's other parts of industry, whether you're doing it for credit risk and for making credit decisions, healthcare decisions, et cetera. And we're actually starting to see some of the rebound on that. So we've got to get a better understanding of these models. There's fundamental research to be done, or we have to come up with alternative models to get us that wonderful performance that we understand better. And if we can't do that at the minimum, let's at least put constraints in place to say, okay, that machine learning model, I'm actually using that as an optimization. I have constraints that guarantee that the outputs from the system fall within a bounded, known, safe space. And then maybe I'm not as concerned if I don't understand exactly why I optimized on this point in the operating space. But we've got to make much more progress on explainability.
Gene, you see a healthy investment environment and interest in...
Everybody's AI today, just like everybody was, no. And there's a ton of investment. And it's good because the government's throwing money at the problem. But I'm a pretty simple person, so if you asked me what I hope to see from AI, and as a non-technologist, I hope to see the speed to decision-making at the battlefield, at the edge, whether it's the cyber edge or whether it's the physical battle space, being able to make those decisions more real-time based upon having that information accessibility and having it easy to use for the people, for the kind of tactical user,
Right.
having AI be applicable to help them make the decisions that they need
Right.
and not make it so difficult, to use and to have to program. That's what I hope to see from it.
Okay. Well, that's it. We are out of time. I want to thank you all for attending the session, and please join me in thanking our panelists for their wonderful comments. Thank you all very much. I'm supposed to say that this officially concludes the Intelligence and National Security Summit, but that's not entirely true because there is a happy hour immediately following this. I didn't want to tell you that in advance because I knew you'd leave early. There's a happy hour immediately following this panel sponsored by INSA and AFCEA downstairs. So thank you very much for attending. I hope you enjoyed the summit, and everybody travel safe. Thank you.
Great.